afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Bonfire. So today, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to be reading Chapter 6. So we are still in the Salisbury Plain, and we need to see how this noxious weather turns out for the poor Canadian Expeditionary Force. Okay. Chapter 6. The weather went from terrible to disastrous. Endless, relentless rain, raging winds were getting on the Major's nerves. Except for the persistent dampness, he was reasonably comfortable in his tent thanks to long underwear, good wool blankets, and a wool nightcap. But any comfort he might have felt gave way to anxiety as he was racked with worry and losing sleep over the deteriorating condition of the horses. I, too, felt quite well, due to the Major and Dodge's good care of me, but many other horses were starting to fail. On Salisbury Plain, the hard chalk base beneath a thin layer of soil did not absorb the water, so it sat on the surface in massive, mucky pools. If the sky did clear at all, the air would be damp with a biting cold, accompanied always by wind. On a day without rain, everything would be usually covered with hoarfrost that would just stay all day with no sun strong enough to burn it off. The icy winds seemed to go right through into our bones. No progress was being made on the horse shelter front, and the Major's disappointment was evolving into a simmering anger. The Colonel and the Major repeatedly requested materials for horse shelters from HQ, or headquarters, and were only met with an infuriating silence. The Colonel, the Major, and the Brigade's officer at least got respite a few times in the nearby village of Devizes. My favorite stable was at the Bear Inn, our Brigade officer's mess. Staying there was a gift for us horses, too. We got to sleep in lovely, dry, straw-filled stalls in the barns behind the inn for a night or two. The other place in Devizes was a cozy hotel called the Ark. One night we stayed there with Captain Cosgrave and General Edwin Alderson, the English general in charge of all the Canadians. He was a senior career soldier who had fought in South Africa too, and many battles even before that. In the weeks to come, he would have high praise for us Canadians. In too short of a time, though, it was out of our comfy lodgings and back into the cold, wet, west, down, north camp. The night of December 2nd, there was a terrific storm, even worse than the usual awful weather. The gale-force wind seemed to pull and blow from every direction, and the rain was torrential. Tents blew down, and my lean-to shelter simply blew away. The Major, Dodge, Lex, Captain Cosgrave, and several soldiers from the brigade went against the rules. They led about 24 of us horses in pairs into the trees for protection from the battery. It was scary as they let us in. Branches noisily whipped every which way, and some even broke off and landed on us. Wild shadows danced across the trees and us too. I tried to be calm, as an example to the others, some of whom were panicking. As ever, I took my cue from the Major, who was calm but determined. We were hardly picketed on settled in the wood when 2 British officers from HQ appeared in the dark. One was a colonel with a shock of white hair, a white handlebar mustache, and chilling pale gray eyes. He spoke very rudely to the Major. "You there, McCrae, isn't it? Listen here, McCrae. What part of no picketing horses in the woods around Salisbury Plain do you not understand? Get those blasted horses out of the trees at once." Even in this gale, the HQ staff refused to bend the rules about tying the horses up in the forest. The Major, Dodge, Cosgrave, and Lex untied us all and let us back out into the howling gale again. Captain Cosgrave, never wanted to stick too closely to protocol, asked the Colonel, "And what's the reason for this rule? Can an exception not be made? These horses are failing without shelter and every day in this damnable weather." When the major found out the reason, his face turned scarlet and his eyes filled with tears of frustration and anger. I've never seen him in such a state and hoped never to see him like that again. The colonel ignored Cosgrave's question and stormed away. But his adjutant, a young captain, apologetically told him the woods needed to be protected as habitat for foxes because of the sport fox hunting. Fox hunting on Salisbury Plain was a higher priority than the welfare of the soldiers and their horses. For the first time in my life, I, Bonfire, fox hunter extraordinaire, felt ashamed of my sport and disgusted with the humans who participated in it. The next morning, Lex Helmer's beautiful bay gelding was found lying dead in the lines. He was a fine horse, but a thin-skinned, scantily coated thoroughbred, just not able for these awful conditions. He had died of exposure in the night. Even oats, a little extra fuel for us horses, would have helped, but there were no oats, due to our host's lack of interest in making any available to us. The storm and its aftermath was the last straw. Getting nowhere for requests for horse shelters, the colonel and the major had been inquiring about renting a large farm for the brigade and its horses. New Copse Farm was 2 miles northwest of the present camp at West Down. They were allowed to make this arrangement, and on December 8th, 200 horses in the worst shape were moved to New Copse Farm, where they could finally get out of the elements and begin to recover. The staff at HQ also relaxed its rule about picketing horses in the trees. We could now be kept in the wood. Sadly, it was too late for the black and white cayuse. He was tough, but he was used to the dry lands and the bald prairies in southeastern Alberta. His hooves had rotted beyond recovery from standing in muck for too long, and he had to be put down. No foot, no horse. The New Copse Farm was heaven for all of us horses and men after our windswept camp. Magnus and Monty both had cases of ringworm, but that was easy to treat. They were otherwise in good health, although they had to be kept away from all of us horses. The men had to be careful around them too, until it was all healed up. Thor was among the worst cases of exposure after weeks of standing out in the cold, rain and wind. He had to be treated with extra care and food until he recovered. He was a hide-draped skeleton, and any trace of his former feistiness was nowhere in evidence. I felt genuinely sorry for him. Shortly after our arrival at New Copse Farm, wooden huts were completed for most of the men. They left their bell tents for what were supposed to be more comfortable barracks. Well, they should have remained at the tents. Although cold and damp, the tents were at least well ventilated, unlike the warm huts, which had tiny windows and forced the men into close quarters. The men, upon leaving the warm huts, would get chilled to the bone. This and the poor ventilation led to more illness, with fatal consequences. In January of 1915, a meningitis outbreak swept through the huts and left 27 soldiers and a chaplain dead. Our lodging at New Copse Farm turned out to be short-lived. One thing I learned about the military is that circumstances changed continually and, as often as not, abruptly. We horses, being such creatures of habit, found this disconcerting at first, but we gradually became as hardened to it as the soldiers. The only sure thing in the military, I learned, was that nothing was for sure. The weather improved a little on our last days at the farm. Several times the major and I rode out with the colonel and King to watch our batteries drill and the gunners set fuses, registered and fired on our targets. Our drivers cleaned harnesses and practiced harnessing teams quickly and driving limbers, part of a gun carriage, and the guns to certain points of the plane. The firing of the big artillery guns was a new thing for me and something I had to work hard at getting used to. The sheer loudness of the explosions made every nerve in my body jangle and actually hurt my ears. I wanted to run in the opposite direction, but the major was calm and he forced me to stand. There was nothing to do but to tolerate it, but it was something I would always dislike. Also, aeroplanes flew around overhead. Good grief. Like giant noisy birds they were, and just another thing we had to learn to abide. So much newness and change, there was just no point of reference for most of what we were being exposed to on a daily basis. Other than observing and inspecting drill, Major spent most of our last days on Salisbury Plain inoculating hundreds of soldiers against typhoid fever. A few men refused to take the shot and were sent home as a result. He told Dodge they probably had cold feet and thought it better that they find out now rather than once we were in the war. With the improved weather in the last days, the colonel was happy. The major was happy too, to be involved in artillery drill and something other than his arduous medical duties at last. Our brigade was broken up briefly, and then all of it reunited loosely around the village of Devizes. And that was where we stayed for the next short while until our departure for France and for war. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of chapter 6. So one thing that I think this chapter does an excellent job of illustrating is that in World War II, more men died from infection and disease than they did actually from bullet wounds. In World War I. I find that absolutely just bizarre. And how at the time there was so much that was considered a higher priority, as you saw here, than the safety of the men and the horses, such as the fox hunting. So that was a huge issue with World War I, is how the complete lack of cleanliness and medical care that the soldiers faced. And the men hadn't even made it to the war yet at this point, and there were still men dying of disease before they even got there. And the appalling conditions of the trenches, which we'll get to see a little bit of when we get into the next section of the book, really does show how difficult it was during that time. And it wasn't just enemy armies that they had to deal with. It was infection, disease, and terrible conditions and bad food, and that carried more men off at this time than most things. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed today's reading of Bonfire, Chapter 6, and please join us again for Chapter 7. Have a good evening. Bye.